So I'm going to start with Harriet Lewis, Ph.D. Is it Konesens? Konesens Development in Westchester, Illinois. She's going to talk about NGOs and interfaith policy development in Nigeria and Cameroon.
Thank you very much. I am excited to be here with you today, to be here amongst scholars and practitioners and the royal family. And I'm going to share with you a few thoughts on interfaith policy development within the context of Nigeria and Cameroon. Next slide, please. So why this topic? When I learned, and just kind of flip through a little bit, but on this page right here. When I learned of this conference and its focus on living together at peace and harmony, I thought about, well, what can I talk about as it relates to NGOs? My background is in NGOs. I have over 20 years in NGO experience, refugee resettlement, survivors of gender-based violence, youth, and so that's why the topic is specifically focusing on NGOs. As with many people in this space, we wear multiple hats. So not only am I a founder, principal of Konesens Development, which is an international consultancy providing capacity building for NGOs and small governments in different parts of the world, but I'm also senior director of an organization in Chicago called the Inner City Muslim Action Network. We have an affordable health clinic and do organizing and other activities for people within a particular part of Chicago and Atlanta. And then also, personally, I intentionally live an interfaith life. I go to I attend church services on Sundays, and I also attend Juma prayers on Fridays. I read the Holy Quran, and I also read the Holy Bible. Just want to share that little tidbit about my personal life with you. And then also, a little bit more personal about this particular topic. While doing this research, I did my ancestry DNA test, and I found out that I'm 22% Nigerian, and I'm 10% Cameroonian, and I'm 16% Ghanaian. So I was really happy about that. All right, so in process for this research, specifically focusing on NGOs and policy development, I had an idea of what I wanted to uncover. I wanted to uncover the process of how NGOs and grassroots organizations develop policy. I had an idea of what that looks like because I've done this within the States and I know what that looks like in process. However, how we do things in the United States is not necessarily the same thing that occurs in other countries. So I set out the research, I interviewed some NGOs, I conducted some surveys, I did some literature reviews, and this is what I'm going to share with you. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm sure everyone is familiar with a map of Nigeria and Cameroon. This is the areas that are blotted are the areas where it's been impacted by Boko Haram, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about Boko Haram in this presentation. Next slide, please. Although living together should be easy, we know that it's not often the case. In the Holy Quran, in Al-Hujurat 13, it says that God made us into nations and tribes to get to know one another. And in the Holy Bible, Hebrews 13, it reads that we should not forget to show hospitality to strangers and to continue to remember those in prison as if we were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourself is mistreated. So, as we're talking about living together in peace and harmony and loving everyone who's been mistreated and everyone as our brothers and sisters, that's not the case for everyone. So this is a picture of Aisha. This was from an article in the New York Times. Some people don't want to live with her in her community. Why? Because she was captured by Boko Haram. She was forced to marry someone. She was impregnated. She had a baby. Some people don't want to live with her because they're not sure where her alliances lie. They're not sure how that baby's going to grow up. Next slide, please. Next slide. And this is Mustafa. Not everyone wants to live with him either. He witnessed two of his brothers being killed right before his eyes, who were forced, who did not want to join Boko Haram. So he was forced to join. He was forced to strap with an AK-47, went out on and attacked villages along with the rest of others. And so now he's going through rehabilitation. So in May 2017, UNICEF stated that because of the attacks, children who escape or are released by Boko Haram come to be viewed with suspicion and rejected by their communities. Next slide. So, what's being done? So, what does a socially cohesive society look like? According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, we want to get to that point of a socially cohesive society. We want to fight exclusion and marginalization. We want to work towards the well-being of all of its members. We want to create a sense of belonging. We want to promote trust, and we want to offer its members the opportunity of upward mobility. So I'm going to talk to you just briefly. The three primary components when we're thinking about social cohesion include social inclusion, social mobility, and social capital. Continue to go through. So sometimes we get stuck. We think that by bringing different groups together, we think by bringing people of different ethnicities together, or bringing different people of different faiths together, that that's enough to create cohesion. However, oftentimes, even though we may be the same people in one room, if people still feel disenfranchised, if they're not able to grow economically, don't have the freedom to move from different spaces, that's not a cohesive society, and at times you're going to find disruption from time to time. We see this even in the United States, where every time you see a child who's been killed by a police officer, that's because this society is not as cohesive as it needs to be. And so we see these things being played out in different ways. Next slide, please. So we're going to view social cohesion strategies through interfaith and policy lenses. And I'm going to focus on two UN Security Council resolutions. I'm going to focus on UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which addresses women in conflict, and UN Security Council Resolution 2250, which addresses youth. So UN Security Council Resolution 1325 calls for the adoption of a gender perspective to consider the special needs of women and girls during conflict, repatriation and resettlement, rehabilitation, reintegration, and post-construction. And the three that were highlighted before is actually the focus of this organization that I interviewed, the executive director, Sylvia Ndogmo. She's from Cameroon, Cameroon Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Cameroon. It was founded in 2015 as a result of increasing regional security. I'm trying to get to my slide. They do a lot of things to promote peace and security in the area. Specifically, they are doing activities to promote that specific UN Security Council resolution. Some of the things that they do solidarity visits and workshops. Continue through, please. They actively encourage men and boys in awareness-raising campaigns against gender-based violence. And continue, please. And they engage in religious and traditional leaders as stakeholders in discussions, specifically in sensitization. So the next couple of slides are some of the things that they're doing on the ground. This is in collaboration with UN Women, as well as with the Ministry for Women's Empowerment in the country, where they created a women's space in the Menawa camp, which is in the far north of the country. And they do activities both in the far north of Cameroon as well as in the east. That's where the primary of the camps are at. In the far north, you have the camps where the refugees were fleeing Boko Haram, and then in the east of Cameroon, you have people who are fleeing Central African Republic violence. Here you have some of their sensitization trainings as it relates to gender-based violence, and the work is also interfaith, so it's not just any specific group. We're talking about women and men from both Christian and Muslim backgrounds in this setting. And then here in Eastern Cameroon, you have other trainings that are taking place as it relates to gender-based violence. So now I'm going to highlight an organization that I'm connected to in Nigeria. It's not the only organization that's doing work that's addressing UN Security Council 2250, but they specifically do work with youth. UN Security Council 2250 addresses participation, protection, prevention, and partnership development, disengagement, and reintegration of youth, both boys and girls, or young men and young women who are impacted by violence. And so this organization I'm lifting up right now is New Era Educational and Charitable Foundation. Its founder is Dr. Emmanuel Iborba, and they focus on peace building, peace education, peer mentoring workshops in the country, in central Nigeria as well as northern Nigeria. They're based in Jos and Plateau State. Next slide. So what I'm going to lift up right now is a program that I've been working with them on. It's still in process. It's called Project Scarlet, Strengthening Citizens Against Radicalization Through Leadership and Reintegration Training. It has 3.5 primary areas. First area focuses on stakeholder engagement, getting stakeholder buy-in working with the local leaders to make sure that everyone is involved in the process of this community education effort, and then also providing peace education, peer mentor training around living together in peace and harmony, and then third, trying to replicate that and duplicate the work by sensitizing and working with civil society organizations, NGOs, and faith-based organizations and faith leaders. You don't want to leave the faith leaders out because faith leaders also have influence within the communities. So this first, can you go back to that slide? Although everyone's probably already read the slide while I was talking. But the first slide was sessions that they were meeting with stakeholders in Plateau State, religious leaders, civic leaders, as well as military and security leaders. Next slide, please. Here, examples of interfaith peace education, where they're having sensitization trainings and, not sensitization trainings, these peer mentoring trainings with young girls and young boys, Muslims and Christians in this area. Next slide. And then here is one of the trainings, NGO trainings they were doing as relates to this project. Next slide, please. So this was an example that I wanted to focus on as far as implementation of these international policies. But we don't want to get stuck with the international policies. I want to show basically how an example of these international policies being implemented on the ground. But we also want to encourage and support policies that come from the other direction, as it should be, especially when policy are directly impacting the lives of people. So I want to discuss a few more projects that support interfaith policy making in the process. And so, Wealth Cameroon, in addition to the work that they do, they bring different groups of people together. So one of the things that they did as it relates to interfaith policy making and process that leads to policy making, they got together with a couple of organizations, several organizations, and sent out a press statement that in 2016, in response to a lot of the attacks in Cameroon from Boko Haram, they wanted to send a message of unity to all Cameroonians of all ethnic groups and religious affiliations. They wanted to accelerate the drafting and implementation process of UN Resolution 1325, and they wanted to ratify the Arms Trade Treaty to reduce the amount of small arms in the country in order to reduce the violence. Also, and I spoke about this, I was asked a question about this yesterday, and I am no expert in this area, but we do know that history was removed from the curriculum, and there was a concerted effort for many years that there was an idea that if history is reinserted back into the curriculum, the correct history, that it could possibly lead to a reduction in the violence in the country because we know more about each other, and we also know what happens as a consequence of the violence, and we can possibly reduce the violence if young people know the history. All right. These are some examples of interfaith dialogue that has occurred in both of the countries. We were talking about the young women who were kidnapped earlier. So this is can we scroll through? So 2 examples of interfaith action in the country. Thousands of multi-faith women in Nigeria and around the world rallying for the release of abducted girls. Also Cameroon, this has actually happened next right here. Not only in Cameroon, but also many countries around the world. We found this to be true in Iraq. We found this to be true in Central African Republic, where Cameroonian Christians or Christians would guard mosques and Muslims would guard churches when there's this religious violence. But I wanted to lift this one up. Also, as it relates to interfaith dialogue, there are institutions in place in both countries. In Nigeria, you have the Nigerian Interfaith Action Association, and in Cameroon, you have the Cameroonian Association for Interreligious Dialogue. Some common themes during the process of interviewing and surveys, there were some common themes that came out during the research. Ecumenical interfaith training. And so this actually came out a lot, because even though we're talking about interfaith dialogue and Muslims and Christians talking, there's also some challenges within each one of those religious institutions, within each one of those faith traditions. So For example, we talk about Boko Haram in Nigeria, and there's some issues with Islam, but it also, or not, it not being Islam. And then in Cameroon, there's an issue with Christianity. There's been a wave of religious fundamentalists within Christian tradition in Cameroon. And so both, that came out a lot within the research. Also better use of the media, including the social media. And then more civil society organizations incorporating interfaith dialogue in the process in their programs. So moving from interfaith dialogue to interfaith action and then to interfaith policy development, we need more NGOs and more faith-based organizations to become involved in development of policies that support social cohesion. It's not going to happen oftentimes from the federal level or the international level down. It has to happen from the ground up. People have to be responsible for the policies or for making the change, the sustainable change in their lives. And that one way that can occur is by supporting the development of laws that address their daily lives. And so I am suggesting to actually work through the NGOs, and that the NGOs also work with the faith-based organizations and the faith and the imams and the priests, which can be challenging because on the ground, NGOs believe sometimes that, these people are conservative, these people need to be, that sometimes NGOs believe that we need to have a secular society. But if people are influenced by their religious institutions, we have to work together, we have to find a way, to work together in order to create a sustainable change. So, a framework for engagement in interfaith policy development, understanding and respecting the values, structures, and leadership of other religious institutions, seeing the other as your brother and sister, focusing on shared values and a rights-based approach. And that's important, that even though I may not agree with you, I may not agree with your lifestyle, I may not agree with how you identify yourself, that everyone has a right to exist. That's important. Identifying strategic entry points for collaboration, ensuring adequate competencies, and building and convening on technical strengths. So next steps. Support reintegration and living together in peace and harmony by, 1, supporting NGOs and faith-based organizations as being community drivers of social cohesion through training and social inclusion, social mobility, and social capital program development, creating pathways for mainstream social participation of marginalized groups through training and civic engagement activities with a focus on youth and women. And last slide, regularly engaging the media outlets, including social media, increasing town hall and community meetings, developing additional interfaith councils while engaging and using existing councils. Sometimes the councils exist, but they're not doing anything. They may have a dialogue once or twice a year, but they're not really leading action on the ground. So utilize the existing institutions. And then ensure that policy advocacy is indigenous. Even though I talked about UN Security Council resolutions, we also have to make sure that that security resolution comes from the ground up, that supports the well-being of all people. Thank you.